Well, hey there. I hope you are having an incredible, incredible day. And I am so excited to share this founder with you. He founded a company called Wave, and then he went on to found Churnkey. And with all of the innovation he's created, behind this founder is someone with an incredible heart. And he found himself burdened by student loan debt, $250,000 in debt after going to law school. And he made a bold decision to take a risk and say, well, I'm not going to get out of my student loan debt by being an attorney. I'm actually going to choose the path of entrepreneurship. I'm going to choose a path that's more risky. He taught himself how to code while he was driving a shuttle bus on Kiwa Island. And he really took these deliberate steps to empower himself, to pay off his debt, and to become a leading entrepreneur. So I get to share with you today my interview with Nick Fogle, the founder of Churnkey, and he's also an amazing dad. And we're going to talk about all sorts of things, not just his entrepreneurial journey, how he got out of debt, how he looks at situations and identifies risks. But most importantly, we're going to talk about his heart, how he navigates stress, and even how he handles being somewhat of an introvert. So with that, let's get started with this episode of Raw and Real Entrepreneurship.
This is Raw and Real Entrepreneurship, the show that brings the no-nonsense truth of what is required to start, grow, and scale your business. I am your host, Susan Slack. Well, what is up, Raw and Real Entrepreneurs, wherever you are in the world? I hope you're having an incredible day. And Nick and I were just chatting prior to coming into the show, and we were talking about his first childhood business. And I know that many of you listen to the show when you're driving with your kids, or we have a lot of young people listening to the show thinking like, what can I do to really change my destiny and get my start? So Nick, I know you had a childhood business. What was it?
It was yard work, basically, landscaping, very basic landscaping. Early on in my life, I learned that by having my own cash or my own savings, that unlocked freedom to do things, to buy things. And I think my dad fostered that at a very young age, that, you do the right things, you go and do these tasks, and there's a reward afterwards. So by the age of like 12 or 13, took my first foray out into the world outside of my household. And I had an old lawnmower, and we would pay for gasoline. It was my brother and I actually did it together. We printed off all these flyers. Fogle Boys Yard Service or something was the name of it. And we plastered them everywhere, all over the neighborhood. And we would actually drive the lawnmower, big neighborhood, like drive this lawnmower all the way across to people that would pay us. Wasn't a lot of money. It was like $20 to mow the grass. But it made a big difference. It made an impact on me. One learning point, though, that I didn't account for as a kid, being naive, was that I was spending a lot of money in gas because I was driving this lawnmower across the neighborhood, and that was eating into my margins. So that was a good lesson. That was like, well, at the end of the day, I was only maybe making 10 or $15 after all the costs were accounted for.
How long did it take you to realize that?
Probably a few months.
A few months. That's pretty quick because, one of the reasons startups fail is limited cash flow. It's the top reason. So you learn something as a kid that most people don't even realize as an adult. People will go into business. I had to do this case study recently for MIT, which is riskier, creating a multi-sided platform, which we're going to talk about, that you've got built, right, in your newest company, or starting a restaurant. And I said, well, the risk is equal in both, because if the founder doesn't know what they're doing, from a P&L and they can't do forecasting. And so I love that you learned that so early. But you didn't say, oh, well, okay, I got this flavor of entrepreneurship. I'm going to go to school. I'm going to study business. You went to law school. What made you decide to do that?
Well, originally I was looking at the business side. I studied economics at Clemson here in South Carolina, and graduated toward the top of my class, but the timing was not great. I was actually out. This is fall of 2008. I was like really excited. I had some job offers. I was interviewing with Bank of America's investment banking division at a sushi restaurant, September of 2008. And everybody listening knows what happened next. The bottom fell out in banking and the housing market. So I said, okay, well, here I am. I've got, this degree, but there are no opportunities in banking or in finance that I was looking at. So I said, I guess I'll go to law school. So I kind of doubled down on education, which it actually was a worse decision. Now I'm grateful for having gone to law school now. I think there's a lot of value in that. But when I look at the cost and what went into that, from opportunity costs and the financials of student loan debt, it was a bad one.
How much student loan debt did you have?
At the peak, it was about $250,000. It's funny. There was kind of this epiphany I had, and during law school, like I knew these were going to be high, and I've always been very careful with expenses. But I went to a private law school here in Charleston, and it had always been my dream to live in Charleston. So it was kind of what I saw as a cool opportunity. And I knew that I was going to have about $150,000 in student loan debt, that's a lot of money. No matter how you look at that, that's a ton of money. What I did not account for was how the interest would compound over time. Even being, a background in finance, like I was naive to that. And the other thing I didn't realize is that on the government program, there was, they have programs where you pay a percentage of your income, discretionary income. I didn't realize, though, that by paying the minimum amount, my loans were negative amortizing. So I finished law school in 2012. I sort of stuck my head in the sand knowing these were big and I would have to find a way to pay them off eventually. But the moment that was just a breaking point for me was I logged into Navient, my servicer. It's Christmas Eve, 2015 or 2016. And I had a balance of $244,000. They had grown that much in the 4 or 5 year period since graduating.
Yeah. And you think about this whole, like, money isn't cheap anymore. First and foremost, right? We're seeing that in the M&A world. We're seeing what's happening with people with mortgages, and housing isn't affordable. I just had a conversation yesterday with a young couple in Maui they're telling me that even because of the fires, and there are limited numbers of homes for studio apartment, super tiny with just a hot plate, it's over $2,000 and it's not even accessible. And so we're living in a time, but they're still giving away student loans so easily. And a dentist could graduate with hundreds of thousands of dollars, a chiropractor, or even someone doing a degree in puppetry, I'm not even kidding, could still have hundreds of thousands of dollars and not even a usable degree. And you made a decision that you were going to get yourself out of this situation in a very unconventional way. Because most people, Nick, from what I've read about you, you're not wired like most people. You're a really good human and you just think differently. And you said, well, I'm going to solve this by starting a business. Most people would think that's too risky. How did you rationalize the risk?
Well, I looked at it logically. There was an emotional element, as all things, have that component. But then logically, I looked at the numbers, and these loans were growing by $50, $52 per day at the peak. If you think about that, I think at the time I was making $60K a year. And depending on where you go and when you finish law school, for instance, here, the market was a lot of people want to live here. So there's a high saturation of attorney jobs, which drives the salaries down. So I was like, okay, well, I could start my own law firm. And that feels risky because, ultimately I could control my destiny there, but I didn't really love the practice of law. I was not fulfilled with that. I've always been somebody that liked creativity and having more impact in a broader sense of the world. And in law, it's pretty difficult to have that. So I reached a point in about 2012, 2013, where I realized loans weren't even that high yet, but I realized that the trajectory I was on wasn't something I was happy with. There wasn't a lot of room for entrepreneurial creativity and unlimited upside potential like you have in certain sales jobs or entrepreneurship. So I made a difficult decision. I was recently married at the time. We were so broke at this point that we couldn't afford our rent. So I had to get a cash advance on a credit card. It was the last charge I could make, maxed out the credit card, paid one more month of rent. And then I did a housing wanted ad on Craigslist. I mean, this is how desperate I was. I said, housing wanted, young married couple, non-smoking, no pets, all the things people look for. $1,000 max is all we can afford. And we were very fortunate. We talked about Kiawah Island prior to recording the call today. But there was a family out there. They had a guest house they built. Nobody was using it. So they said, hey, we know this is way out here in the boondocks, but we would love to make this work for you and your spouse. That came from Craigslist. It was just an amazing opportunity. And things started to turn around at that point. It wasn't easy. In fact, this was the point where I realized I needed to learn to code because I had this startup idea around law. I wanted to make law more accessible to everyday people, to laymen. And I tried to reach out. I think a lot of entrepreneurs do this. You've got a big idea. You have no idea how to build it yourselves, particularly in software. And I reached out to all these software engineers and developers and said, hey, I'll give you equity in the company. But the software engineers are highly sought after. And nobody's going to just take some skin in the game for your idea to build it. So as I learned that, I was like, okay, I've got to take matters into my own hands and at least build out an initial version myself. I didn't know how to code. So as we had moved out here, I started driving a shuttle out at Kiawah Island, which was a humbling experience, not because that job was beneath me, more because I had just gotten a law degree and had opportunities to go work for a law firm. And every relative and friend I had was just like, what is Nick doing? Has he lost his mind? And I spent a good 9 months out there working on this startup, building it. And by having something I was seeking to build, I learned and became very effective at writing code. And I got to a point where I realized this idea was too ambitious for what I was able to do at the time. But I was able to parlay that experience I developed to an internship at a publicly traded software company here. I got that and I realized that I've got no pedigree. They look at this guy with a law degree who's an interim software developer, and they see you as flaky or high risk. And I just realized I had to prove this to them that I wanted to be there. So I'd be the first one there, last one to leave, worked on the weekends, learned as much as I could. And then that turned into a full-time job. And I had a few years there where I could grow my skill set and grow within the business.
And Nick, it's amazing. Firstly, what language did you learn how to code in?
I learned JavaScript, and this was at a point where JavaScript was finally becoming more recognized as a full stack framework. Mm-hmm. And I was very fortunate and lucky to have chosen that framework because it proliferated between the years of 2013 and 2016. It became a standard that a lot of organizations used.
Absolutely. And it is a foundation for other things like JSON, which I'm taking a course in JSON right now. So that's okay. For everyone listening around the world, you're like, okay, Susan, stop nerding out here. So for people who aren't aware, so Kiawah Island is absolutely beautiful. I was sharing with Nick, my husband and I were at a wedding there last fall, and it's this amazing. There are different resorts and homes there. There are also a lot of alligators there. I have never seen anything like that. And I went, Nick, the path that follows it goes where you turn to go down the road to Kiawah Island, there's a path that runs parallel. It goes over the causeway. So yeah. I was training for a half marathon and I had to do a 12-mile run. And they're every so often I'd see these watch for alligators, and I ran by these bodies of water and I saw the eyes peeking out. And I think I ran 12 miles faster than I've actually ever run in my life. What was the biggest alligator you saw?
There were some massive, monster gators because they're protected. Nobody could hunt them or mistreat them. So they just grow to be massive. And maybe so there's going to be a listener who's an alligator aficionado expert and call me out, but maybe 15 or 16 feet. Hard to quantify how big some of these guys are.
Yeah. We have people, as I said, who listed 171 countries. So they've never seen an alligator before, but these are dangerous, one, and they're there and they're just everywhere and they're protected. So Nick's driving this shuttle he's saying, you know what, I'm going to invest in myself and I'm going to invest in my education. And that's one of the core messages of the show all the time. Like, there has never been an easier way to learn new skills. You can go to YouTube University, I call it. You can do LinkedIn learning. One of my mentors is 71. She's taking all sorts of LinkedIn learning classes on AI. There's always a way to learn. So Nick, you go and now you're interning, you've got a little bit of coding experience, and the idea is still brewing. Like, I need something of my own. So how did you transition to that?
From the software company, like that, where I was in a cubicle, then how do you get out of that?
Yeah.
Well, this is that phase of life where I still have this albatross hanging on my neck of 220,000 in debt at this point, paying my payments, being a good boy, doing what the government's telling me to do, and realizing that it's not enough. And I negotiated as hard as I could to get pay raises. I was flying internationally to go do implementations. I was taking anything they could, but the upside was just, it was capped. There was no way I could get what I needed to actually just pay the interest on my loans to keep them from growing. So I got back into building again, and I was working on side projects constantly to polish my skills. I think in a lot of situations, learning just for the sake of learning, it's not the best recipe. I mean, I'm a lifelong learner. We were talking about this at the beginning of the call. I'm naturally curious. I do enjoy learning, but you can learn much faster if you have a reason. The why has to be bigger than the what. Mm-hmm. So I was learning as fast as I could because I was desperate. Like, I knew that the government wasn't going to bail me out. Like, nobody was coming to save me. Like, I had to figure this out myself, or I was going to be stuck for the rest of my life. So we can fast forward to like 2015, 2016. I was able to join an agency locally. So kind of took a lateral move that had higher risk. So I'm moving up the risk curve. It was very much like I hate to say this expression, but to kind of eat what you kill. Like, we're going to try to place you with companies, but if we aren't able to place you, you're not going to have any money that month. But I was able to make probably $250,000 the first year I did it, because I just billed as many hours as I could. I worked on every project. I was constantly doing like double dipping. And on top of that, I was building a new startup. This was another good learning experience because a co-founder I knew, our wives actually introduced us because we were constantly talking about startup ideas. And the first thing we decided to build was like a precursor to Clubhouse or Twitter Spaces. We loved podcasts, and we wanted a native audio medium to discuss our favorite podcasts within communities. And we were just way too early. We lacked the experience we needed to build this. And it was a very hard problem to handle without venture capital. And where I live regionally, it used to be like this, and it's still kind of like this. It's hard to raise if you're not in one of these concentrated capital areas like San Francisco, New York, LA. Mm-hmm. So that was an obstacle. We weren't able to raise funds. I built this giant platform. We had a web app, a mobile app, just been spinning my wheels for 12 to 18 months. And we were making like $100 a month from sponsorships. We'd even closed some iHeartRadio and ESPN shows, but they just weren't willing to pay what we needed to keep this platform going. And where things really turned around was this Hail Mary. I realized that one problem is that we needed to get more listeners tuning in and seeing the great content and exchanges that were happening on our app. So I said, well, on social media, audio didn't share well back then. You didn't have native video like you have now. You didn't have native audio like you have now. So I found a way to take audio snippets, turn them into interactive videos. Now it's called an audiogram. You've probably seen these on social media, but we were the first ones to commercialize this. And it was the 11th hour before we were just about to hang it up with this startup where we tried this. I pulled an all-nighter. I built out this platform where we could quickly do this and share it to social with the hope that we'd get people to come to the app. The interesting takeaway from this experience was that people still weren't interested in the app, but they were very interested in this tool. And they said, how are you doing that? How are you making those? Could I pay you to make those for me? And that was the light bulb moment where we realized, wow, we've never felt the pull of the market for anything we're doing. We've been pushing with no response. So the larger story arc in my life has been, particularly around business, is if you are persistent and you listen to customers, you listen to the market, you might not be right with where you start. But by staying the course and continuing to persevere, eventually you will find a pain point that needs to be solved. and you'll be able to develop and grow a business by solving that.
And you're resilient, and you take calculated risks, right? We've had founders on the show, Nick, that are like, okay, I'm all in. I'm, sleeping on, my buddy's floor, and I'm building this. And then we have people like yourself who say, you know what, I've got a family and I'm going to do this very deliberately in my spare time, but my spare time isn't random. My spare time is very calculated. I'm very focused. I understand that I have to be all in during this time. And that ethos, I remember the first time we created a wave, and the first time I saw one, and I'm like, whoever designed this is absolutely genius, right? This, the concept of it. So you ended up selling that company. How did that transaction take place? Like, how did the offer come? I'm so curious about this.
Yeah. I love that idea around asymmetric bets, and everybody's going to have different risk tolerance. And a lot of that depends on where you are in life, what liabilities and responsibilities you have. And you're right. Like for me, the only thing I had was time. And I just had to if you can double the amount of work you're doing in a week, you can double the amount of output relatively. So I had all these different asymmetric bets I've been placing around startups and this agency I was a partner in. But what became Wave took off. We sunset that old product. We sold it for pennies on the dollar, basically. We rolled that into what we called Wave. We spent 3 years growing Wave. And after about a year, we started to see decent traction. And we said, maybe one day we could pay ourselves from this business. So it wasn't overnight. I mean, it was a grind. And startups are always a grind, particularly when you're bootstrapped and you're just doing it without any external capital. Mm-hmm. And we got an email from Spotify. So this was not the company that we weren't acquired by Spotify. Don't get your hopes up. That was the lesson there. We were too tiny at that point for them to acquire us, but it was a light bulb moment where we were like, oh, like there is demand for what we have. Like what we've built is attractive. So we started thinking more about long-term exits. The second year, we finally made enough to pay ourselves. And it was about enough to pay the mortgage, maybe a little bit more, and then continue to reinvest a little bit into the company, continue to grow the business, and we'd get more inbounds. And this is something that happens, as you grow your brand and awareness, you'll get inbounds from people. And by the end of that second year, we were probably doing $50,000, maybe $40,000 in recurring revenue per month. So not a giant business yet, but we had an inbound from a broker. And he said, I represent someone who's very interested in acquiring your business. And I'm still chipping away at student loans at this point. I've probably got 200,000 left. And we get the numbers, we get the basic letter of intent with the ranges that they're willing to pay, with earnout, things like that. And I am just chomping at the bit to take this deal, pay down my loans, and then move on to the next thing. And it was nice to have a co-founder who was in a different financial position, who could see things a little bit more logically than I was able to see them at that point. Because I realized I was nervous. I was like, we have to take this. So much of my net worth now is anchored to this business. Before there wasn't a dollar sign associated with my ownership in the business. Well, now there was. And I was so fearful of losing that, through some black swan event or something.
Sure.
But it was the right decision to decline that. And at that point, I was reinvigorated and more motivated to work. By the way, I was working on another startup as my full-time job, my 9 to 5. I was continuing to do Wave nights and weekends because I still didn't have enough money to make that work. But around this time, I was like, okay, I need to go all in on Wave. It represents so much of my net worth. We've got, some issues we need to address. So a year of optimizing, a year of growing, COVID hits. We were very fortunate because COVID and the, work from home trend represented a nice tailwind for the business. We tripled over a year. We met with a business broker and we said, okay, we're looking at potentially selling this business. They said, great. We told them the price that we were hoping to get for it. And he said, you're not going to get that because you have very high churn. We were talking about podcasting and consistency and how important that is. And podcasts, about 80% of our revenue came from podcasters. The problem with podcasting is there's this phenomenon called pod fade. It's very hard to stay consistent with a podcast. Yeah. Somebody would pause their show for a bit or just stop recording altogether. They'd no longer have a need for the product. And we were having about 15% monthly churn. they said, you've got to get that number down if you want anywhere close to what you have. So we spent a good 6 to 9 months then hiring consultants, throwing money at the problem. It didn't work. We ended up building a series of tools within the app that helped us to meet podcasters where they were. If it was a budgetary issue due to COVID, offer them a discount. If there was a situation where they needed to pause because they have a seasonal show, offer them a pause. And we found that this had a massive impact. We got churn from 13 to 15% range down to 8% per month, which you have the churn. Broker says, great, you are ready to sell. Let's in 2021, we'll go to the market. We'll see what we can get. Before that happened, and this is the story in entrepreneurship, you always get these serendipitous events that happen. They seem to correlate or all align. It's kind of, when it rains, it pours is one way of looking at it. And then the flip side is like, sometimes the good things just kind of compound. And in November of 2020, before we even talked to the broker, by the way, brokers sometimes take 10 to 15% of the sale price. So we knew that was going to be a big hit. We were fortunate that in November, we got 5 different entities that were interested and had reached out with cold email. 3 of them were very serious. We did meetings, we negotiated. And the day before Christmas Eve, 2021, same morning, we got 3 letters of intent to purchase Wave for a range of different values. And going into the holidays, that was the best feeling ever, to know that we had optionality. We could find the right new home for the business. That was a painful thing, is you've sweat and poured all this energy into a business for years. You don't want some private equity shop to just chop it up for parts. So that was an important factor. But yeah, we found the right buyer, and we sold the company in March. I think it was March 1st, 2021, for a mid 7-figure exit.
And then you paid off those student loans. How did that feel? Someone who's listening right now who has that burden, what was the feeling? The
wild thing is that I paid them off before the sale. I was so aggressive, and I had this fire under me to get to zero. I wanted my net worth to get to zero. That was so important to me, that idea that I could be unburdened and just have a net worth of zero. And that's part of why I was working at a startup 9 to 5. I was working at Wave. We were taking profit distributions from Wave. I was drawing a salary, living on as little as I can, driving a very old Honda Civic. I paid them off the August before we ended up selling. So it was an amazing feeling to have that out of the way and say, wow, now I can catch up on retirement. I've never had, any kind of runway at all. And we also knew that, you have an exit, most entrepreneurial minded people are going to want to move on to something else. And the cool thing, and part of the reason to sell Wave, was we were sort of ready for that next adventure. And we'd identified a big problem through our working on churn and realizing there was a huge gap in the market for addressing business churn. So we took the set of tools we had, and that same month, it was an amazing feeling to know that, well, now I have runway to actually be present with my family. I had 2 kids at this point, wanted to spend more time with my kids, but I would have runway to start building the next thing and get that to market. So it's like the optionality and freedom only increased through the sale.
And if I had to dissect this, looking from the outside in, and goodness knows, I've said this on the show, I've read every book Dave Ramsey's ever written. I've, listened to his show, been to his events. If I had to dissect this, this is maybe not something even quantifiable. It's strangely energetic, is what I'm hearing, Nick, is the moment you unburdened yourself of this shackle, even though it was your reason to start the business was to get out of debt, you got out of debt. And then once that was gone, it just freed up emotional energy that really brought this next iteration for you. And going through that, all of the lessons you learned, even as a founder, to be absolutely frugal, to, to watch every penny, to take a look at opportunities, but also to be working full time and do that. And I want to commend you. That's not easy as a parent. And I know from my own background, to be working full time and, to have multiple businesses and try and get to, whatever it is, soccer games, dance recitals, like all of it, it's really hard. And, and stay married and everything else. Right. And, and there's a lot of wall kicking moments. And so from what you learned with the churn, you started Churnkey. And I was looking at the stats, that are up on the site, and your lower cancellations by up to 54%, which is massive. So there was obviously a problem you were seeking to solve. And yet this is a different level of business you're focused on, because this is, like, I call it high B2B, more enterprise, as opposed to before in your business, like you're, with Wave, it was B2B, but it was a different kind of B, right? A small B, not a big B. Now you're going big B. So talk about Churnkey, like where's the business at now? Like, do you have employees, and what is your reach?
We, and it's interesting too, you have some success in business, and sometimes that goes to your head. I've always been somebody with imposter syndrome, but after selling a business and seeing it go from zero to, a huge exit, you come into a new business. It's like, let's rinse and repeat. It's going to be easy. And to your point, it was a totally different market. Like, we were serving mostly like B2C prosumer style customers. We had a couple, like Dave Ramsey's podcast was a customer early on. Like, we had some B2B, but you don't have the pricing. I mean, it's all like, one size fits all pricing. And with Churnkey, we made the mistake of trying to go after like small SMBs initially. And it was a year of pain. We almost gave up on Churnkey in that first year, because the things that worked in the past that we thought we were so great at were not applicable to this business. So we had to relearn how to start a business for this different market and build a different product with different table stakes. It's been about 3.5 years now at Churnkey, and the last 18 months, like, we've really hit our stride and started growing fast. Today, we protect $1 billion, almost said a trillion, $1 billion in subscription revenue. Mm-hmm. So that's across all the customers we serve. That's the amount of dollar value in the subscriptions that they have. We have about 300 different customers that we're serving, and we've recently grown the team a lot. If we rewind back this time last year, we had 4, maybe 5 people, and now we're at 15. So we've tripled the team size. And again, this is a very different type of business. With Wave, we had like 3 or 4 at the peak. There was not many of us, with some contractors to help out occasionally. But it's just a very different type of business. And I'm grateful for a new learning opportunity. Mm-hmm. I was the CTO of that last business, and I'm the CEO of Churnkey. So there's been a learning curve, thinking through things a little differently and viewing them through a different lens. Having somebody else manage the tech is, in some ways, it's a load off because of, the late night fire alarms. I still get late night fire alarms, but it's just, it's been a really great experience to have this very new crucible to go through. I think all these startups are kind of a crucible. Even the debt, that whole saga, they make you stronger because you encounter this resistance, and you have to strengthen your mentality and your focus and your willpower. So I love the opportunity to continue to grow that over time.
It's huge. I think about, you said something so powerful, which is, it was a different kind of customers, a different kind of learning. We were coming from the ether of what we had just accomplished in the sale, and to kind of get humbled and relearn, right? And to go through that. And it's challenging. I remember when I went from B2C to B2B, and large enterprises, multi-billion-dollar corporations were our target customers in my last venture. And there were things that I had to learn about the inner workings of those customers, and what are their, not just their pain point, but their multiple pain points, their multiple decision makers, how to navigate that world. And so, to your point, it's humbling yourself and saying, okay, I have this backpack full of tools, and some of them are applicable here and some of them are not, but I don't know when the other ones are going to be applicable. And the more tools we can put in, it's huge. I want to ask you, how do you deal with stress?
That's a great question. So I actually have a therapist that I see every 3 months. And it's something I've been doing since those early days after law school when I was going through this crisis. Same guy for that long. I think eventually you start to internalize and find ways of managing stress. I can't say that I live a stress-free life. I think it's about the way you interact with stress. The human experience is not supposed to be easy. It's supposed to be hard. If it's easy is relative. Everybody has hard things you go through. So what's easy for one person and one person's journey might be hard for somebody else. But yeah, stress in general is something that lately it's been a lot of learning how to delegate. Business stress, trying to do all things and getting better at delegating and hiring people, being comfortable with that and trusting others to help with things. I have 4 kids now, just had twins. So it's like, I have to be able to say, hey, this is something that I'm stressed about and feeling like I have to own and manage and do.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of your internal expectations that can increase stress. Finding ways to empower somebody else who is excited about taking that on. My employees love taking on new things. So I guess that's a very roundabout way of answering how do you handle stress. I think the best answer is that I recognize stress as, what it is, like being able to say, hey, I'm feeling stressed out right now. Like, what do I need to do? Where's the stress originating? And what do I need to do to move beyond it? Some stress is good, right? There's this tension. It can push you to achieve. Too much stress leads to burnout. So I think it's also being self-aware enough to realize that.
Yeah, the self-awareness is huge. And I love that you mentioned therapy, right? Like I had Dave Asprey on the show a couple of years ago, and Dave was like, I have a team. I have a therapist, I have a coach. For myself, I have a business coach I talk to once a month, therapy. And then I know, like, I'm a situational extrovert, Nick. So I'll say in front of thousands of people listening, like, I know for me, if I've had like just, a lot of networking events and travel, I need to sit back, and my go-to is why I keep even studying at MIT. I find it very relaxing to go write a white paper or to go like look at an engineering problem. That for me is like, I just don't want to talk to anyone, be in front of my computer. And people are like, why do you keep studying? And I'm like, because that's for me, it's a bit therapeutic, is that learning. And I have friends that code, and it's the same thing. It's like, I just don't want to talk to anyone right now. I'm just going to go code, or I'm going to go paint, or I'm going to go play the piano, or I'm going to go do something.
I'm glad you mentioned that, how that relates to the awareness, self-awareness. I learned that I was more introverted. It's a spectrum, right? Like you've got way out extroverts and then way out introverts. And I'm somewhere kind of like a moderate introvert, where I would go crazy if I never talked to anyone. Like I need social interaction. And I do well with just a few regular conversations and small groups of people. But if I go to a conference, it's not that I'm shy, but it's like, I feel just so drained afterwards. And it's, I think people like me can thrive in this world where you're doing more remote work, where it's time boxed, it's predictable, there's less stimuli. But it's an interesting exercise too, to think about, well, based on where I am on the spectrum and I'm trying to avoid burnout, like what is the right amount of activities to bite off? I don't want to bite off more than I can chew and then result on feeling burnout for a few days.
Yeah. And that, Dan, I've mentioned this book on several shows, and have to get Ben Hardy on this show. So Dan Sullivan and Dr. Benjamin Hardy wrote a book called 10X is better than 2X. And that the whole philosophy is like this whole concept of 10X, like let's grind it out to get our 10X result. It actually isn't going to get you there. But it's firstly that self-awareness, and then saying, am I doing activities where it's low lift, big impact, especially as a CEO? right? And I can wear many hats. I can wear the CMO hat. I can wear to an extension like product officer, do all those things. But it's like, am I doing what is going to cause 10x for the company? And if I'm not, I'm doing a lot of 2x activities, I'm going to burn out. And so that thesis, and I love that you said, to be self-aware. And I think we're seeing a different kind of CEO these days, a different kind of founder, and especially that men and women are having the conversation, Nick, to say, I take care of my mental health, and these are the things I have to learn. And I know when it's time to step back. I know when it's time to delegate. And we're really giving permission to that next generation of entrepreneurs. My final question for you is, I want to go back to the student loans. What advice do you want to give to someone who's listening, who has a lot of student loan debt?
Yeah. You mentioned Dave Ramsey, and part of it is psychology and the mentality that you approach an insurmountable obstacle. Because a lot of people, it's like you feel so trapped that it's like, I'm going to put my head in the sand. Maybe the government will forgive it, or I'm just going to have these for life and pay the minimums. Number one is to start filling your mind with positivity. So I would listen to the Dave Ramsey show, because you hear these stories of people who overcome incredible odds and pay off debt. I mean, they're constantly talking about that. So I would fill my mind with that. I would listen to Tony Robbins, I had found an old like 1980s cassette that had been converted to CDs, and it was all about personal power and optimism. So the psychology is step one, filling your mind with these things. If you look out in the world and you Google student loans, it's all negativity. You're already feeling negative and bad about it, or foolish for taking out the loan. So you have to switch that and start filling your mind with things that are positive and optimistic. As you think about tackling the goal, developing a plan that's realistic to your current situation. And it's okay to set something ambitious, but I think I love the saying that people often overestimate what they can do in a year, and they underestimate what they can do in a decade.
Yes.
And that has been my mantra for a long time. And I'm not saying that it's going to take 10 years to pay down student loans, but I think it's the idea of being willing to look at it that way and saying, okay, well, what would it look like? What would I need to do? Just pull out a Google sheet or something. What would it look like if I paid down this debt in 10 years? Okay, is there any way to do it faster? And maybe I could do it in 5. Yeah. And that's how I started. I started out with like a 8-year plan, I think. And I got excited because I started seeing progress. And I said, what can I do to make this faster? Dave Ramsey calls it, you got to get a bigger shovel if you're in a really deep hole. Big shovel means bigger income. So I started to think through, okay, well, if I work this many hours, if I have these different opportunities, maybe play some asymmetric bets, then I could get it to 6 years. I ended up paying them down in about 3.5 from that initial goal of 8, because I became laser focused on this, continued to stay optimistic and positive about what I could do. And I just continually was able to accelerate that path to paying them off. So that would be my advice. It's what worked for me.
I love it. And to that point about, failing to plan, Jack Canfield said, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. Right. And to your point, I went for a few years, like every run, I was every day listening to Dave Ramsey, I don't buy new cars now, even a lot of times, and some people might be shocked to hear this, I don't buy new clothes. Like I'll go on the reel and it's certain things I will buy new, like let's just level set there. But oftentimes like I used to be like, oh, I need this designer handbag. I'm like, no, I don't need it. First and foremost. Number two, I can go buy one that's secondhand and it's half the price. Right. And it is making these decisions, and it's not because at some point it just becomes part of the fabric of who you are. And that translates into business as well. Like, and I keep thinking like, even with the new company, we're using contractors, like a DevOps team. We don't have any employees, 0 employees. Everyone is a 1099. And because I'm making different decisions this time, and like every single penny, I want every penny to multiply into 10 pennies, essentially, if that makes sense. So Nick, I want to thank you so much for being here and your wisdom, and congratulations on your expanding family. And me of all people, I know that you're juggling a lot, and I really love what you're doing with Churnkey, because I think that, it's easy to look at SaaS businesses and paint everyone as a a Shopify or paint everyone in a certain bucket of, a multi-billion-dollar company. But a lot of the SaaS businesses play in a different arena before they get there, and they go through those turbulent times, and you're making such an impact to say, hey, we're going to help people, we're going to lower the churn, we're going to get you profitable. And I know that in the Bible it's written, wisdom shall be known by her children, and you're creating a lot of beautiful legacy. So congratulations.
Thank you. This has been a blast.
Well, thank you. And to everyone listening, Nick and I, wherever you're listening to us, Spotify, iTunes, wherever it is, give us a 5-star review. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button. And if you want to share any feedback from the show, tag Nick and I, or go to studentslide.com, write it in, and I read all your reviews. So with that, God bless, go rock your day, and I will see you in the next episode.
Well, hey there. If you are listening and you heard the interview with Nick Fogle, I hope you had the experience I did, which was really seeing this man's heart, his brilliance, his genius, and his humility and vulnerability. And if you are watching on YouTube and you didn't watch it and you're here for Startup Diaries, check out the interview, because I always do an interview before I do the diary of the week. And so this week, I want to talk about your voice. And one of the things that has come up with my interviews lately is that most successful entrepreneurs have a team of people around them, and they have a coach, they might have a therapist, they have people who help them with their mental health, they have mentors, they read books. And so, like other entrepreneurs in my space, I have a coach. And I was working with my coach, and we were talking about my voice. And I want to talk about in this diary, it's pretty vulnerable, about how we, not just as women, but as men, give up our voice too. And so as an entrepreneur, it's so important. You heard Simon Sinek say, start with a why. So why are you building your business? But it's not just about the business why and the impact you're going to make and the lives you're going to change and what you're going to build. It's about that emotional, intrinsic why. And I'm not just talking about the why of accomplishment. I'm talking about sometimes the why of proving ourselves. And if the why is about proving ourselves, who are we proving ourselves to? And I grew up in a Chinese Canadian family, and with my single dad, Joe, and my grandmother, Agnes. And I had a childhood that was very rigorous. There were piano lessons in the morning. I was expected to get straight A's, practice the piano after school. On weekends, it was church and Chinese school, and then lots of sports. There was swimming, there was running and skating, working in the restaurant. And there were times too when even if I would roll the change incorrectly, not with the amount, but my grandmother didn't like it was too loose, she'd break it open, pour out all the change. I'd have to do it again. I'd fold the napkins. If they weren't perfect, she'd rip them apart and I'd have to do it again. And at the time I did it, and I didn't realize that I was becoming very resentful and I was feeling constantly criticized. And I remember one time I came home from school and I had all A's and 1 B. And instead of saying, oh, look, you got all A's, my dad just focused on the B. And the B was in phys ed, I think, of all things, and I was overweight. So that was a whole other area of consternation. But as a result, there were times in my life where I strove to prove myself. And, you don't do a lot of the accomplishments that I've had, whether it's doing the Ironman with a fractured pelvis, it's a story for another day, doing 6 Boston marathons after being diagnosed with MS. The things that I've done and accomplished, you don't do them without some internal desire to prove. And the message I have for you today is that to be a successful entrepreneur, the chances are there's part of you that still has that prover part. And that prover part, my question for you is, who are you proving it to? Because at some level of success, there's going to be a time when you've already proved whatever it is you need to prove to that person or that person is never going to give you what it is you secretly want from them, whether it is telling you that they're proud of you or that they love you or you did a great job or whatever the case is, and it becomes so empty. And so I was working with my business coach today as we're building out this new company. And if I am sitting here in a place as I have nothing left to prove, but I can choose to be a stand for something instead, then what does that stand for? And I have always been a stand for women. And I have always been a stand for possibility. And if I'm a stand for women and I'm a stand for possibility, then, and there's nothing left to prove, then everything that we're building at the pause is really to allow women to feel that whatever it is they're going through in terms of menopause, there's a possibility that they don't have to struggle anymore. And so I just want to share this from my heart because it's challenging at times being an entrepreneur, and these are raw and real diaries. There's no scripting. I often don't even know what I'm going to talk about. It's just us having a conversation. And if you are someone who realizes that you've been trying to prove yourself to someone, you know, a parent, a partner, an ex-partner, whoever it is, that's going to be empty at some point. And the moment you decide to shift it to what you're standing for and something that is so beautiful and so inspirational, and just knowing it's okay, you've already proven what you needed to prove, and seeking the approval of others, especially some people are never going to give it, it's going to leave you feeling exhausted and vacant. Let it go. Be the entrepreneur that I know you can be. Be that person who goes out there and makes a difference and changes lives, because you know what? The world needs your solutions, and the world needs you to take a stand in a different way. So with that, that is this week's diary. If you are on YouTube, my friends, drop a comment below. I'd love to see your comments, and don't forget to share this channel with your friends, other entrepreneurs, because these diaries are about as raw and real as they get.